Did you hear what they just said to her?" The words cut through the music and chatter like a knife. The ballroom, filled with glittering chandeliers, golden drapes, and the smell of expensive wine, suddenly grew heavy with silence. Conversations that had moments ago been full of laughter came to an abrupt halt as heads turned in the same direction. In the center of the room stood a tall black woman in a sleek emerald green gown that shimmered under the lights. She wasn't just another guest. She was Naomi Carter, a name that carried weight in every boardroom across America. Billionaire, innovator, self-made success story. The kind of woman people admired and feared at the same time. But in that moment, the admiration in the air shifted into something else. Shock, disbelief, and even a little bit of dread. Across from her, members of the Whitmore family, one of the wealthiest and most arrogant dynasties in the country, exchanged smug looks. Their laughter carried a sharpness that wasn't just about a joke. It was about belittling her. They had mocked her openly, without hesitation, as if she were just another outsider trying to sneak into their exclusive world. Guests watched with widened eyes, their expressions revealing the same unspoken thought. Did the Whitmores really just say that to her? The tension spread like ripples in water. Some guests sipped their drinks nervously. Others pretended to check their phones, trying to act as though they hadn't heard. But everyone had heard. The Whitmores weren't exactly whispering. They wanted her to hear, wanted her to feel like she didn't belong in their opulent circle. What they didn't realize, however, was that mocking Naomi Carter in public wasn't just cruel. It was about to become the most expensive mistake of their lives, because Naomi wasn't a woman you could dismiss. She wasn't someone who had inherited her fortune or coasted on family connections. She had grown up with nothing, worked harder than anyone else in the room, and built her empire brick by brick, deal by deal. Her reputation wasn't built on money alone. It was built on resilience, brilliance, and the kind of determination that terrified her competitors. And yet, here she was, standing in the middle of a room full of billionaires, treated like a novelty act by a family whose wealth was older than some countries. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't respond with anger. Instead, she stood tall, her posture elegant, her chin lifted just slightly higher, her emerald gown glowing like armor. Her eyes scanned the room calmly, as though measuring each person, silently asking, "Are you with them or are you with me?" And in that moment, everyone felt it. The shift in power, the invisible current that had swung in her favor. She didn't have to shout or create a scene. Her silence was louder than any insult they had thrown her way. The Whitmores, of course, didn't notice. They were used to people laughing at their jokes, even the cruel ones. To them, this was just another night of flaunting their dominance, another reminder to their guests that no one could touch them. They believed their billions made them untouchable, their arrogance as solid as the marble floor beneath their feet. What they didn't know was that their empire was about to crack, and Naomi Carter would be the one to split it wide open. People whispered at the edges of the ballroom. "She's going to walk out," one woman muttered. "No, she's too smart for that," a man countered. "She'll make them regret it." Eyes followed Naomi's every movement, waiting for her reaction, waiting to see what she would do. Some guests secretly hoped for fireworks, a dramatic confrontation, raised voices, maybe even a drink tossed in someone's face. But Naomi was far too composed for theatrics. She wasn't here to entertain. She was here to remind them, and everyone watching, exactly who she was. Her story was legend. She had risen from poverty, fought her way into industries that had shut doors on people like her for decades, and turned her company into one of the most powerful in the world. She had faced critics, competitors, and doubters, but none of them had ever seen her falter. And now, in front of the Whitmores' sneering faces and their expensive audience, she had an opportunity to show once again why she was feared and respected. The air in the ballroom grew heavier. The Whitmores still smirked, completely unaware that their little joke had just lit the fuse of something much bigger than they could control. What started as a moment of cruelty was about to spiral into their greatest loss. All it would take was Naomi's decision, a decision that would cost them not just their pride, but billions of dollars, their reputation, and the power they had clung to for generations. As Naomi's calm smile flickered across her face, one thing was clear to everyone watching. The Whitmores had just mocked the wrong woman. Earlier that evening, before the moment that left the ballroom frozen, the Whitmores had made sure to give Naomi a grand welcome. From the outside, it seemed like nothing but luxury and charm. Their mansion sparkled like a palace, crystal chandeliers, red carpet entry, and servers gliding through the crowd with silver trays of champagne. It was all designed to impress her, to make her feel like she was stepping into a world she should be grateful to be part of. But Naomi Carter wasn't easily dazzled. She had seen wealth before, she had created it with her own two hands, and she knew the difference between genuine respect and hollow theatrics. To her, the smiles on the Whitmores' faces looked more like masks than warmth. The party itself was branded as a celebration of the upcoming merger, a historic deal worth $5 billion. On paper, the partnership between Naomi's tech empire and the Whitmores' energy conglomerate looked unstoppable. Together, they could dominate entire industries, combining Naomi's cutting-edge innovations with the Whitmores' old money infrastructure. Investors were already predicting record-breaking profits. People called it the deal of the decade, and many believed it would seal Naomi's place not just among America's top billionaires, but in history books. That's why she had agreed to attend the party, to signal unity, to reassure investors, and to celebrate the next step in a journey that had taken her from nothing to everything. But what Naomi noticed almost immediately was how different the Whitmores' idea of celebration was from hers. For them, this wasn't about honoring a partnership. It was about putting her on display. She could feel it in the way people whispered as she walked by, in the way members of the family introduced her, not as an equal, but as their special guest. The words sounded kind, but the tone carried something else, something condescending, something that said, "We're letting you in, but remember, this is still our house, our table, our world." As the night went on, the subtle remarks started piling up. One of the Whitmore sons, drink in hand, leaned close and said with a sly grin, "That's quite a bold dress. Naomi, I guess when you're trying to stand out, green is a smart choice." The comment drew a few chuckles from his friends, who looked at her as if she were some sort of exhibit. Naomi smiled politely, refusing to give them the reaction they were fishing for. Another cousin decided to mimic her early accent, exaggerating it in front of others while saying, "Remember when you first came here? Oh, you sounded so different. Hard to imagine someone with that voice becoming a billionaire." Laughter followed again, but not from Naomi. She simply sipped her champagne and let the sting roll off her shoulders. What they didn't understand was that silence can be stronger than retaliation. Naomi knew something the Whitmores didn't. Every comment, every insult, every joke at her expense was being carefully catalogued in her mind. She wasn't the type to lash out in the heat of the moment. That wasn't how she had built her empire. She believed in strategy, in patience, in letting people dig their own graves before she lowered the rope. So she stood there gracefully, letting them think they were winning. To them, her calmness was weakness. To her, it was power. What stung the most wasn't the words themselves. Naomi had faced worse in her life. It was the smugness with which they said them, as if they had earned the right to mock her simply because their fortune had been passed down through generations. They didn't respect her achievements, didn't see the brilliance that had brought her into that room. To them, she would always be an outsider who had clawed her way into their kingdom. What they failed to realize was that Naomi wasn't there to beg for a seat at their table. She was there because she had built tables of her own, and now they needed her far more than she needed them. As the evening unfolded, Naomi watched carefully. She observed how the Whitmores spoke about other guests, how they treated the staff serving drinks, how they bragged about crushing competitors with casual cruelty. The more she listened, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a family with money. This was a family convinced of their superiority, blind to the fact that the world was changing around them. And if there was one thing Naomi understood better than anyone, it was that arrogance is always the beginning of the end. When Mrs. Whitmore finally made her infamous remark, the one that turned the entire night upside down, it didn't shock Naomi. In fact, it confirmed everything she had suspected from the moment she stepped into that mansion. The fake smiles, the backhanded compliments, the dismissive jokes, they were all leading up to this. But what the Whitmores couldn't see was that Naomi was already preparing her next move. While they thought they were humiliating her, she was quietly reshaping the course of the deal, reshaping the fate of their empire, and reshaping the story that the entire world would hear by morning. By the time the laughter of the Whitmore family echoed across the ballroom, Naomi had already decided this deal, no matter how big, was no longer worth her name. Then came the moment that would turn the entire night upside down. The instant where whispers became silence and silence became history. Naomi had been patient all evening, smiling at their snide remarks, ignoring their condescending laughter, and playing the part of a guest who didn't mind. But inside, she had been weighing her choices, measuring how far the Whitmores were willing to go. The answer arrived when Mrs. Whitmore herself, standing tall in a sparkling silver gown, decided to say the words that cut deeper than all the mocking comments before. It happened as Naomi approached their circle to discuss the next steps of the merger. The music had softened, the champagne glasses clinked softly, and a few nearby guests leaned in, eager to hear how one of the biggest deals in modern business would be finalized. Mrs. Whitmore gave Naomi a smile, but it wasn't the kind of smile that carried warmth. It was sharp, calculated, and dripping with superiority. Then, with a chuckle that made the nearby family members laugh, she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Isn't it incredible? From rags to riches. Who would have thought someone like her could sit at our table?" The words hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the room. Conversations died mid-sentence. The violinist in the corner faltered for just a moment before resuming his notes. Guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, some shifting from one foot to another, pretending to be distracted, while others stared outright, stunned that she had said it so openly. The smugness in Mrs. Whitmore's tone made it impossible to believe it had been an innocent slip. It was deliberate, a reminder that in her eyes, Naomi would never truly belong, no matter how much money or success she brought to the table. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't gasp, didn't lash out, didn't even blink. Her stillness was more powerful than anger. In that frozen second, every eye in the room shifted to her, waiting for her reaction. Some people expected her to walk out in humiliation, while others quietly hoped for a confrontation that would explode into chaos. But Naomi wasn't a woman who lost control. She was a strategist, a visionary, someone who knew that true power didn't come from loud words. It came from actions that shook the ground beneath your enemies. She gave a small, calm smile. Her emerald dress glowed brighter under the chandeliers as she lifted her glass, looked Mrs. Whitmore in the eye, and said, "You're right. It is incredible what someone like me can achieve. And tonight, you're going to find out just how much power someone like me truly has." Her voice was steady, clear, and sharp enough to slice through the arrogance in the room. A few guests sucked in their breath. Some lowered their eyes, embarrassed for the Whitmores. A handful even looked at Naomi with admiration, silently cheering her on. But the Whitmores? They only laughed. Mr. Whitmore patted his wife's arm as though she had cracked a clever joke. One of the sons rolled his eyes and muttered, "Oh, she's dramatic." They brushed off her words like they were nothing, completely blind to the storm she was about to unleash. But Naomi's calmness wasn't for their benefit. It was for hers. She wanted them to believe she had accepted their insult, that she had no plan, no retaliation. That was the mistake they would regret most. Because Naomi Carter was already calculating her next step. At that very moment, she knew the merger was dead. She would not sign her name on a contract that tied her legacy to people who mocked her existence. She would not let a family drunk on inherited wealth believe they had the right to humiliate her publicly. What they thought was a victory, what they thought was her silence, was actually the sound of the walls closing in on them. Guests would later say they felt something shift in that room after Naomi's words. It was almost invisible but undeniable. The balance of power tilted. The smirks of the Whitmores didn't feel as strong anymore. Their arrogance no longer looked like confidence. It looked like ignorance. People in that room would whisper about it for weeks. How Naomi, without raising her voice, without even breaking her smile, had turned the entire atmosphere upside down. By the time the Whitmores dismissed her words and moved on to their shallow small talk, Naomi had already made her choice. There would be no 5 billion partnership. There would be no future where the Whitmores could boast about using her to expand their empire. Instead, they had planted the seed of their own downfall. And Naomi, she had just given them their final warning. When she walked away from that circle, champagne glass in hand and her emerald gown trailing behind her, people couldn't help but move aside. She wasn't just leaving a conversation, she was leaving a legacy moment, one that would soon unfold in ways the Whitmores could never have imagined. The following morning, while the Whitmores were still patting themselves on the back for hosting what they thought was a successful evening, the storm they never saw coming was already at their doorstep. Naomi's legal team worked through the night, drafting documents with precision and urgency. By sunrise, the Whitmores' offices received an official notice. Naomi Carter was withdrawing from the $5 billion merger. No explanation was given in the first lines, just a clean, professional termination of the deal that had been hyped as the most powerful business partnership of the decade. At first, the Whitmores dismissed it as some kind of mistake. "It's just paperwork," one of the brothers said, laughing as he sipped his morning coffee. But then their phones started buzzing, not with congratulations or opportunities, but with urgent calls from investors, board members, and the press. Naomi hadn't just pulled out of the deal, she had gone public. Within hours, every business news outlet was running the same headline: Naomi Carter walks away from 5B Whitmore merger after racist party incident. The story spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with clips and whispered accounts from guests who had been at the party. Some described Mrs. Whitmore's words, others detailed the mocking tone of the family throughout the evening, and nearly all of them praised Naomi's calm, powerful response. Hashtags with her name trended worldwide, not because of her wealth, but because of her dignity. People who had never heard of the Whitmores suddenly knew them, but not as powerful billionaires. They were now the villains of a story that captured everyone's attention. For the Whitmores, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Investors panicked, pulling out millions within hours of the news breaking. Their stock value nosedived overnight, wiping away billions from their fortune. Partners who had been eager to join forces with them began to withdraw, fearing association with a family now tainted by scandal. The empire that had been passed down for generations was suddenly fragile, and the cracks were spreading faster than anyone could contain. Inside the Whitmore mansion, panic replaced arrogance. Lawyers scrambled to draft statements, while PR advisors begged the family to apologize. But their pride made them stubborn. "It was just a joke," Mr. Whitmore argued, waving off the scandal as though it were exaggerated gossip. His wife insisted that her words had been misunderstood. Their children complained that the world had become too sensitive. But no matter how much they tried to spin it, the damage was done. They weren't just losing money. They were losing the one thing they valued even more: their reputation. Naomi, on the other hand, was thriving. Hours after the news broke, she announced a new partnership. Not with the Whitmores, but with their fiercest competitors. The move was a masterstroke, both strategic and symbolic. Not only did it prove that she had countless other options, but it also ensured that the Whitmores' rivals would surge ahead, while the Whitmores themselves floundered. Business analysts praised her decision as one of the boldest and most decisive moves in modern corporate history. But Naomi didn't gloat. She didn't release angry statements or dwell on the insults she had endured. Instead, when asked by reporters why she walked away, her answer was simple and unforgettable. "Respect is non-negotiable. No deal, no amount of money is worth compromising who I am." Those words were replayed across television screens, quoted in newspapers, and shared endlessly online. They became a mantra, not just in business circles, but among everyday people who saw in Naomi a reflection of their own struggles against arrogance, discrimination, and dismissal. What made her decision so powerful was the contrast. The Whitmores had used their wealth to mock and belittle, convinced they were untouchable. Naomi used her wealth, her influence, and her voice to take a stand, showing that dignity was priceless. She reminded the world that money without respect is worthless, and that power means nothing when it's used to tear others down. The fallout continued for weeks. Reporters camped outside the Whitmore mansion, demanding answers. Protesters even gathered at their corporate headquarters, holding signs that read, "Respect is priceless and dignity over dollars." The family tried damage control, issuing carefully written apologies, but by then, no one was listening. They had already been judged, not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, and they had lost. Meanwhile, Naomi's name soared higher than ever. She wasn't just a billionaire anymore. She was a symbol. Universities invited her to speak. Magazines featured her on their covers, and young entrepreneurs looked to her as proof that integrity could win over arrogance. She didn't just walk away from a $5 billion deal. She redefined what it meant to be powerful. And while the Whitmores hid behind closed doors, Naomi stood in front of cameras with grace, repeating the lesson she had lived by for years. Money comes and goes, but respect, once you lose it, you may never get it back. In the weeks that followed, the Whitmores' empire continued to crumble piece by piece, as if every brick of their legacy was being pulled out from under them. The once untouchable family, who had spent generations building a name synonymous with wealth and privilege, now found themselves trapped in the shadow of their own arrogance. Their attempts to salvage the situation were clumsy at best. They issued statements insisting their words were taken out of context, and even tried to stage a press conference where Mrs. Whitmore read from a paper, her voice trembling as she claimed she had nothing but admiration for Naomi Carter. But the world wasn't buying it. The apologies sounded hollow, rehearsed, and most importantly, far too late. The damage had been done, and no amount of carefully worded statements could erase the image of them mocking the very woman who had been poised to secure their future. Inside their mansion, tension boiled over into chaos. Arguments echoed through the marble halls as siblings blamed each other, parents scolded children, and advisors quit one by one. Their company's board meetings grew heated, with investors demanding answers they couldn't provide. The very name Whitmore had gone from a symbol of power to a reminder of scandal. Competitors swooped in like vultures, taking advantage of their weakened position, and every deal they had lined up suddenly fell apart. Business partners who had once fought for a seat at their table now distanced themselves, fearful of being tainted by association. For the first time in generations, the Whitmores were no longer feared, no longer admired, and certainly no longer respected. Meanwhile, Naomi Carter's star rose higher than ever. Her bold move to cancel the deal and instead join forces with the Whitmores' fiercest rivals sent a message that resonated across industries. She wasn't someone to be toyed with. She wasn't desperate for alliances, and she certainly didn't need validation from old money dynasties. She had the vision, the resources, and most importantly, the integrity to walk away from billions and still come out stronger. The world saw her not as a victim, but as a leader, someone who chose dignity over dollars and emerged victorious. Everywhere she went, people celebrated her. Media outlets hailed her as the woman who took down the Whitmores, while others called her the billionaire with a backbone. Universities invited her to deliver commencement speeches, where she spoke not only about success but about the importance of self-respect, in a world that often tried to strip it away. Young women, especially women of color, saw themselves in her story. They saw proof that they could rise, succeed, and stand firm in spaces where they were told they didn't belong. Naomi became more than a business figure. She became an icon, but what made her victory even sweeter was the way she carried herself. She didn't gloat. She didn't rub the Whitmores' downfall in their faces. Instead, she spoke with calmness, humility, and clarity. When asked about the incident during a televised interview, she simply said, "Success without respect is failure. I'd rather lose money than lose myself." That one sentence traveled further than any headline, etched into the hearts of people who knew exactly what she meant. Her story wasn't just about billion-dollar deals. It was about the everyday battles people faced in their own lives. The disrespect at work, the underestimation, the mocking laughter. Naomi had turned her personal moment of humiliation into a universal story of resilience. As for the Whitmores, their downfall became a cautionary tale. Business schools began using their story as a case study on arrogance, warning students that wealth alone couldn't sustain a legacy if it wasn't paired with respect and decency. Their once proud name was reduced to whispers of what could have been, a lesson repeated over and over in boardrooms and classrooms alike. Never underestimate the cost of disrespect. They had mocked Naomi in their home, in front of their peers, thinking it was just another night of entertainment. But they had unknowingly signed away their own future. For Naomi, the incident was not an ending but a beginning. Her new partnership soared beyond expectations, shattering records and proving that her decision to walk away had been the smartest move she could have made. She didn't just survive the Whitmore's insult. She turned it into a stepping stone that lifted her higher than ever. And as she continued to expand her empire, she never forgot the lesson of that night, that power doesn't come from the money you inherit, or the mansion you own, or the family name you carry. True power comes from knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone take it from you. In the end, the Whitmores lost billions, but what they lost most was something they could never buy back: their respect, their reputation, and their influence. Naomi, on the other hand, walked away with more than money could ever buy: the admiration of millions, and the satisfaction of proving that dignity will always outweigh arrogance. The story of that night lived on, not as a scandal, but as a legend, a reminder that no matter how wealthy or powerful someone thinks they are, mocking the wrong person can bring their entire world crashing down. And Naomi Carter? She was living proof that sometimes the greatest victories are born from the moments when you choose to stand tall, even when the world tries to cut you down.